Hi guys, today we're going to talk about prefer, would rather, and would prefer to. So the first thing that we need to know is we use these structures to talk about our choices. We don't have to always choose between two or more options. We can basically say what we prefer. For instance, I prefer tea. I don't need to say I prefer tea to coffee. No, that's not a necessity. Or I could say I would rather drink coffee instead of saying I would rather drink coffee than tea. I don't need to say that. I can just say I prefer blah blah, I would rather blah blah blah. But there's a main difference. I think you realize that. When I'm using my sentences with prefer, I don't need a verb, an action. For example, I said I prefer tea. I didn't say I prefer drinking tea or I prefer to drink tea. No. But when I'm using it with would rather, when I want to indicate my choice with would rather, I need a verb. That's the main difference between prefer and would rather. The first main difference, let's say. After would rather, I need a verb. So it's not I would rather coffee, it's I would rather drink coffee. Alright, let's start with prefer to and prefer doing. The first thing that we need to know is these words, these structures mean the same thing. So they have the same meaning. But the main difference is prefer to. After to, we always use verb one in English. So I prefer doing and I prefer to do have the same meanings. And we use these structures to talk about our preferences in general. I repeat, in general. General preferences. For instance, I don't like planes. I prefer to travel by car. Alright. I don't like planes. I prefer traveling by car. Okay, I think you can see the difference. These two sentences mean the same thing, but we have built different sentences with using different structures. One is prefer to, the other one is prefer verb ing. Both are correct, both are okay. Let's talk about its negative version, negative form. I prefer to travel by car, we said before. In order to make this negative, all we need to do is using not between prefer and to. I prefer not to travel by car. Or if you are using the ing version of it, you could say I prefer traveling by car or and I don't prefer traveling by car. So the main difference is if you are using it with to, prefer to, you make it negative like prefer not to. If you are using the ing version, you do it like I don't prefer traveling, I don't prefer blah blah ing. Okay? So if you are using the ing version, you need to make it negative using don't, doesn't. Alright, let's talk about prefer A to B. I had told you that before we can use prefer without a verb too. I don't need a verb, an action. For example, let's start with the last sentence. I prefer PlayStation. I don't need to say I prefer PlayStation to blah 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 blah. This is my general preference. But if I want to tell people, if I want to indicate people what I prefer to what, I can use this structure, prefer and to. These are like brothers or sister. I prefer pizza to what? To hamburger. I prefer this to this. I prefer Istanbul to Paris. I prefer this to this. Alright? Easy. Let's talk about their negatives. The rule didn't change. I prefer pizza to hamburger. We said I don't prefer pizza to hamburger. I don't prefer Istanbul to Paris. I don't prefer PlayStation. That's all. Now let's talk about would rather. You could see it like this as well, so don't be surprised. Would rather and prefer have the same meanings. We had told you that before. I would rather go home or I prefer going home have the same meanings, alright? Alright, I think you can see the main difference here. After would rather, we always use verb one. It's never went, it's never gone, it's never going, alright? So, but after prefer, we had two options. We could use prefer to verb one or prefer verb ing. But don't forget that they have the same meanings. Alright, but unlike prefer blah blah to blah blah, would rather is used with then and requires a verb. Yes, we had talked about that before. I would rather, I told you before, after I would rather, I need a verb. But with prefer, This was not a necessity. I didn't need a verb. So after would rather, I use a verb. I would rather eat Turkish kebab. Okay, until here, this is okay. But if I want to tell people what I prefer to what, instead of, look, with prefer, we were using to. I prefer blah blah to blah blah. But with would rather, I cannot use to. I need to use then. So prefer and to were brothers or sisters. Same situation goes for would rather. Would rather's brother or sister is then. I would rather eat Turkish kebab than fast food. This is the false version. I think you can see why it's false, because after I would rather, I told you before, I need to use a verb. Here we don't have a verb. That's why this sentence is completely false. Let's talk about its negative. After would rather, if you add not to your sentence, you will be able to make it negative. I would rather eat Turkish kebab than fast food, we had said before. I would rather not eat Turkish kebab. That's all. Now the last one is would prefer to. Again, this has the same meaning. We use would prefer to talk about our preferences. Yes, but there is a little tiny difference between would prefer to and would rather and prefer. We use would prefer to say what somebody wants in a specific situation, not general. Remember what I had told you. I told you that we use prefer to and would rather than to talk about our general preferences. General. They mostly don't change. But look at these situations. Shannon says, shall we go home by bus? Linda says, I would prefer to walk. I need some air. Look, Linda doesn't mean that she always prefers to walk. No, that's just for a specific situation. Maybe she was not feeling that well that day, so she decided to walk. But it's just for that day. It's not a general preference for that moment. Alright? Second one, waiter says, what would you like to drink, sir? Tea or coffee? Carl says, I'd prefer to drink coffee. But we don't know, or we are not sure if this is Carl's general preference or not. Carl said, I would prefer to drink coffee. But at that moment, this is Carl's preference. So this is a specific example. Let's talk about its negative. I would prefer to walk. I would prefer not to walk. I would prefer to drink coffee. I would prefer not to drink coffee. That's all. Okay, now we have would prefer to blah blah rather than blah blah. Let's remember. Prefers brother or sister is to. Would rather's brother or sister is then. Would prefer to's brother or sister is rather than. We use would prefer to blah blah rather than when we are making a choice between options. Okay, I'd prefer to stay at home tonight rather than go to cinema. Look, after would prefer to, verb 1, blah blah, rather than go to cinema. Look, again verb 1. So I would prefer to rather than. It's like prefer to blah blah, would rather blah blah than blah blah. It's the same. Second example, I'd prefer to do my homework now rather than on Sunday. This is what I choose. This is what I choose to this. All right? So think about the brother and sister relationship between them. Okay, let's continue with some online examples. All right, so I brought you some examples from a website called Test English. Let's take a look at the examples. Let's start with the first one. I prefer brown sugar, blah, blah, white sugar. Okay, I already know this. After prefer, if I'm between two options, I need to use to. Prefer to. Second one, I don't want to go out. I'd rather blah, blah, home. Okay, I already know that after would rather, I need a verb. So, but this verb should be a verb 1. It should be verb 1. Remember. I would rather stay home, not staying, not to stay. The third one, I like trekking in the mountains, but I prefer blah blah on a sandy beach. Okay. If you have prefer and after prefer, you have two options. One, you could say I prefer to, verb 1, or you could go I prefer, verb ing. So, you could say I prefer lying on a beach or I prefer to lie, not lying. If it would be I prefer to lie, it would be okay. But only lie, only to lying, no, it's not okay. So we should say I prefer lying. I'd rather go in December, blah blah in May. Okay, what was the brother or sister of would rather? I already know that. It was, of course, then. I'd rather come with you, blah blah here alone. Again, after would rather, if we are between two choices, two options, I should be looking for then. And afterwards, I need to be looking for verb 1. So I'd rather come with you than stay here alone. 6. I prefer traveling by bus, blah blah by train. Okay, here I have prefer. And as you can see, I had used my ing here, but what should I say afterwards? I told you before, after prefer, if I'm between two options, I should use to travel or traveling. I think you can guess which one it is. I prefer traveling by bus to traveling by train. The rule didn't change. Or we could say, I prefer traveling by bus to train. I usually have tea, but today I would prefer blah blah coffee, please. I usually have tea, but today I would prefer blah 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 blah. Okay, what did I tell you before at the beginning of the video? Prefer to and would rather than are used to indicate our general preferences, general choices. But if it's in a specific situation like this, look, normally this guy has tea, but today he prefer to have coffee. Why? Because would prefer to is used to talk about specific situations. Like this. Normally this guy has tea, but today, just for today, he decides to have a cup of coffee. That's why we used would prefer to and verb 1. Okay, number 8. I'd prefer to read for a while, blah blah TV. Look, it says I would prefer to and verb 1. What was the brother or sister of would prefer to? I hear you're saying rather than. Yes, you guys are right. I would prefer to read for a while rather than watch TV. Let's remember, prefer to, would rather than, would prefer to, rather than. Number 9, I'll skip number 9 because I didn't teach you this, because this is would rather in a future form. Like when you're referring to future, you have to use a different structure. It should be state, but I didn't teach you this because this is a little bit advanced. Maybe in the next videos I'm gonna teach you guys this, but not now, so I'll skip number 9. She blah blah to stay in a hotel. Look, it says to stay. So she rather to stay? No. She would rather to stay? No. After would rather we don't use to. The right option should be she would prefer to stay in a hotel. Okay, that's it for today's, guys. I'm gonna share some links down below in the description so you can exercise what you have learned today. Okay, don't forget to take notes to your notebooks. Take care.